Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new Netflix film, Maestro. It just released. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So Maestro it's a biopic of kind of the famed American conductor slash composer Leonard Bernstein, and it's very much a movie that is positioning itself as sort of like an Oscar bait kind of hard hitting drama. It's not typically the kind of movie that I necessarily always gravitate towards, but it is a movie that's been getting a lot of buzz and I think will be a player come like awards season and some of that. So it was a movie I wanted to check out and just sort of see what it had to offer. And I'll say that maybe even surprisingly, I enjoyed this movie a lot. This is a beautifully shot film. It is elevated by some very dynamic acting, and I think it's a compelling story, although one that is not without a few complications. So this movie opens up with a very provocative title card quote, which says, "A work of art does not answer questions, it provokes them, and its essential meaning is in the tension between the contradictory answers." And I think that quote, which is from Bernstein himself, is a very kind of fitting encapsulation of just sort of this film's kind of governing philosophy that really has a message that sort of like music, human beings are just messy. We're self-contradictory. We're very complicated creatures. And kind of like that quote kind of implies, this movie explores really the tensions that define people either internally or else externally without ever really seeking to like resolve those tensions. Because Leonard Bernstein himself, he has like a magnetic charisma. He has this sort of infectious love for people, but he also has a very like insufferable hubris and just a very sort of selfishness to his character, which sort of makes him like neither hero nor villain, but just a very sort of flawed human being. And I think for the most part, sort of the warts and all approach of sort of presenting a more raw, honest depiction of this man does add a lot of nuance and interest to the story. Although at times it does lead to a somewhat unsatisfying experience of watching sort of an increasingly unsympathetic character. And before kind of getting into some of the technical aspects of this film, probably should note that sort of part of Bernstein's complicated character is his homosexuality, and that is very much central to the story, and it's clearly depicted throughout, which we'll get into a bit in the content section of this review. And I think Christians are going to have different opinions on sort of on that focus in the story. Because I think for the most part, this film kind of neither condemns nor condones sort of his sexual activity and sexual behavior. It does present it more in like a matter-of-fact sense. I think kind of his sexuality never becomes the point of this film. Rather, it is just sort of one of the very significant kind of internal and also external tensions that does come to sort of define his life. But the story itself, this is, like I said, this is elevated by two, I think, excellent acting performances. I think clearly positioning himself for awards contention, Bradley Cooper, who stars as Bernstein, as well as the director of this film. And he is dynamic. He is so good in this film. He really does this completely disappear into the role to the point that, like, despite being a very recognizable, famous actor, as you're watching, you only ever see the character of Bernstein. You never see Bradley Cooper as the actor in this. And kind of starring opposite of Cooper is Carey Mulligan, who stars as Bernstein's wife, Felissa. And the character itself kind of mostly lives under like, the oppressive shadow of sort of Bernstein and his fame. So her own kind of internal complexity is not explored with the same depth as Cooper's Bernstein is. But her performance is excellent. And in many ways, she does provide sort of like the emotional center of this film. Maestro is also just a very beautifully shot film. There is almost like a lyricalism to the way the scenes flow together and kind of blend, and just the way they're accompanied with some of this classical music. And the cinematography does a lot of very interesting things. Like there is a lot of surprising amount of just like long, very kind of simple, unbroken, unmoving camera shots of sort of these characters having these long conversations that does add sort of an intimacy to those moments. But at the same time, there's also a lot of just some of the most kind of brilliant scene transitions that I've seen in a movie for a long time, as things kind of very cleverly kind of shift scenes and characters kind of walk from one scene into another one seamlessly, and just a lot of, I think, very well crafted kind of execution just as far as sort of the framing and the filming of this. And kind of interestingly, like the first 47 minutes of this runtime are presented in black and white, which gives it a very kind of delightfully retro vibe before there is like a slight time jump, and then that brings the film into full color. And beyond just sort of the fun of sort of the black and white and some like the throwback vibe, I think that kind of those contrasting aesthetics also effectively work thematically, where it sort of the early portion of this film, the black and white, does have a more sort of simplistic, kind of naive optimism to it, where sort of once we transition to the full color, it does, despite sort of the brighter colors going on screen, it does focus kind of more in on just sort of the harsher complexities of life and kind of the emptiness beyond sort of the glitz and glamour of these scenes. In this film, like I said, it's often compelling, although at times the story can feel a little bit sort of meandering and seeming to like move forward without any very clearly defined like direction or bearings. And I think this is probably an intentional decision, although at least to me, I do feel like some of those sort of story beats, particularly when it comes to sort of Bernstein's sexual infatuations, do become somewhat repetitive. And the film also does sort of lean into like subtlety, almost to a fault, very much sort of trusting audiences to like read between the lines and interpret some of these sort of subtle glances and implications. I think for the most part, I appreciated that the film doesn't just sort of hold your hand and sort of direct you what to, tell you what to think. Although I do think maybe a few more of kind of high energy dramatic moments would have been welcome in this film. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this language, there is profanity in this film. I counted 8 F words, as well as 4 to 5 sort of other kind of more minor profanities. There are also 7 uses of God and 1 kind of utterance of JC in this film. So there is profanity, although most of that actually comes in like one heated argument. Violence, there's no violence in this. The closest this comes is Bernstein does sort of recount like a boyhood fantasy kind of dream he used to have of killing his father, although he doesn't give details as far as that goes. Sexuality, as expected, this is where most of the content to be aware of comes from. Like I said, Bernstein is a homosexual, and he is shown in multiple scenes, like flirting with different men, which includes like stroking their hair or holding their hand. He does kiss one on the lips, I think one on the forehead and one on the cheek. And at the beginning of this film, he wakes up in bed with another man. He's shirtless. His sort of lover is nude, although covered up from the waist down with a blanket. But he does sort of, Bernstein comes and kind of playfully kind of drums on this man's backside. In another scene, a man and woman kind of lay on the floor, presumably after having had sex, although they're both concealed or covered up by a blanket, but they continue to sort of flirt and do make kind of references to the sexual activity that they had. And there's also a scene just sort of near the end of this where an older man does sort of drunkenly kind of dance with a much younger man in the club, with sort of the added context that he is the teacher and this younger man is a student of his. As far as things going on beneath the surface, kind of some themes and worldviews. As I've already said, I think the central theme in this film is this the complexity, like the kind of human nature in tension. And there's a scene where Bernstein is sort of giving a public interview and kind of musing on just sort of the fundamental tension just between like private life and public life. And he makes a comment where he says, if you carry around both personalities, I suppose that means you become a schizophrenic, and that's the end of it. And his life kind of becomes a case study of that assertion, because he is a very kind of contradictory, conflicted man. There's the tension kind of between his love for his wife, while also sort of his more like homosexual desires and flings with other men. There's also just the kind of the tension between sort of the bright lights and the fame and like the public recognition, kind of in contrast to the more darker like, internal feelings of just emptiness and depression that seems to define his character. And there's another sequence where he is observing the performance of a mass that he has written called Almighty Father, and kind of like in a very ironic sense, like as this sublime religious music is playing, he is shown holding the hand of another man as his wife sort of watches on, and kind of that moment becomes the catalyst for sort of the separation between him and his wife, which leads his wife to reflect later, saying, hey, he's just a man, a horribly aging man who cannot just be wholly one thing. He's lost. Kind of the biblical verse that came to mind kind of as I thought about this film, is this the Apostle Paul writing in Romans 7:15, where he says, I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And Maestro, it's never implied that Bernstein hates his actions or is any way like repentant of them, although he is unhappy by the consequences of it. But I do think Paul's words do resonate with his life, and just the fact that as sort of sinful fallen beings, we don't always act as we want. We don't always make logical decisions. We are sort of driven by these conflicting passions that we can't fully comprehend. And the film itself, like I said, never attempts to resolve these tensions, but it does sort of offer the solution at the end. That sort of the answer to that is just to have increased kind of understanding and grace, because Felicity's sort of some of her last words in this film. She says, all anyone needs is to be sensitive to others. Kindness, kindness, kindness. And obviously for Christians, there's more to that conversation that needs to be had, and there's a role for repentance and other things like that. But I do think those words are a very sort of admirable and worthy starting place for Christians, and just sort of having more grace and understanding of sort of the complex people around us. So in the end, I enjoyed this film. I think it's a well-made film. Obviously, it's a complicated film. I think even just the fact that it's an R-rated film about a very selfish and like unrepentant homosexual man means it probably won't have just sort of wide appeal for a lot of Christians. But I think it is a very technically excellent film that is brilliantly acted, and I think does provide a very compelling portrait just of our complicated human nature. But hey, if you guys see this movie, I'd love to hear what you think. Jump into the comments section, share your thoughts if you enjoyed it. If you think that this is a movie that's worthy of the awards buzz, or maybe if you weren't quite as impressed by it, would love to hear what you think. If you haven't done so, I encourage you guys to subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. We got lots of movie reviews and podcasts and interviews and just a bunch of other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through a world for Christ.